Welcome to our second episode of Inside Illustration. This episode is part of the branding season of Inside Illustration, a biannual suite of content brought to you by the Association of Illustrators. We are a UK-based organisation with members from all around the world. We support illustrators across all areas of their professional lives, including advice on licensing and contract reviews, as well as staging events, campaigning for illustrators' rights, and running the annual World Illustration Awards. In this session, we're exploring aspects of branding illustration from both the commissioner and illustrator sides, examining the qualities and processes that make excellent branding images for packaging and more. Members of the AOI have exclusive access to the full range of content for Inside Illustration at theaoi.com/inside-illustration. And there we have in-depth articles, a range of resources, and the opportunity for members to take part in an exclusive creative course on branding illustration. I'm your host, Rachel Emily Taylor, artist, writer, and course leader of BA Illustration at Camberwell College of Arts. Branding illustration is an important area of illustration, commissioned for company identities and logos, their services, packaging ranges, campaigns, and more, creating familiarity and encouraging loyalty and identification for consumers and clients. It aims to ensure that brands are distinct from each other with their own individual personality, connecting with and retaining customers. And today we're delighted to welcome in the studio three experienced voices from the branding world. Heidi Lightfoot, owner of the award-winning branding studio Together Design, and experienced illustrators Kate Larson and Nicola Robson. Kate, can you say a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm a graphic designer and illustrator. I've been working in the industry for over 19 years. I graduated with a first in visual information design from Ravensbourne College of Design and Communication, and I always had a love of illustration. So early on combined that with my graphic design qualification. I've worked in many areas of the industry, from branding, pure graphic design work, to illustrating children's books. But I have a particular love of packaging. I've worked for design agencies and with in-house teams for places like Marks and Spencer's and The Body Shop, and also directly with my own clients. And I've won several awards, luckily, with Together for Fortnum & Mason and Charbonnel and those lovely projects.
Nicola.
I'm a graphic designer and illustrator. I graduated from Nottingham Trent University with a first in graphic design and then became an illustrator as my career continued. I've been in the industry for a decade now and worked with agencies on all sorts of projects, from branding to licensing and everything else in between. Worked for clients like Charbonnel and Walker, the Museum of London, doing more campaigny bits, Cafe Nero, people like that. So it's been a really wide breadth of different clients. I've also then commissioned a lot of illustrators whilst I've been working at Together, actually, and then got to work with illustrators who are painters and illustrators in Australia, and got a massive global breadth of talent that I've learnt to work with over the years. And I've illustrated myself and won a few awards for those bits too, and illustrated for packaging and branding and licensing, advertising, all sorts, everything. So yeah, really varied career so far.
Heidi, can we hear a little bit about you?
Yes, I'm Heidi Lightfoot. I'm creative director and founder of Together Design. I've been working in the design industry for 25 or maybe 30 odd years. Before I set up Together Design, I worked in an agency called Trickett and Webb, which is where I met my business partner, Katia. That was very illustration friendly, and so no surprise that Together Design is also very illustration friendly in our work. As an agency, we work on branding programs, packaging, we work for the arts, education and retail clients, and we have a strong focus on collaboration and craft. So recent projects have included things like the rebrand for a scientific society, book design for Philip Pullman, brand toolkits for Penguin books, and exhibitions, and lots of packaging design. So a variety which we love. And we have an amazing team at Together Design. Many of our team have worked with us for a long time, including Kate and Nikki, who are here today. I think, Kate, we've worked together for 15 years.
Yeah, initially as a freelancer and then as a full-time employee for a bit, and then again now as a freelancer.
Any way we can get her.
Yeah.
That'll be fine by us. And Nikki, we've worked with for over 10 years now, I think.
I think so. My first ever full-time design job with these guys, and then I've gone freelance and carried on working with them.
Yeah. Again, any way we can get her. That's fine.
Heidi, what can illustration bring to branding for a product or company that makes it unique?
It can bring so much to a branding project. So quite often, if we're using illustration for branding, we want it to communicate a big idea, a big theme. So we may be looking for an image that is telling a bit of an abstract story and needs to be quite immediate. You see it in one hit. So that's what illustration can bring. It can communicate so much more than just showing an object or showing a person. It can communicate an emotion, which is very important for branding. If we're trying to show the values or the personality of a company through the imagery.
And what can the process be like when you're selecting an illustrator for this area of illustration? For example, do you look at a range of different illustration styles, or do you have something in mind straight away?
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes we might have something quite specific in mind, and other times we're looking around at different styles. It might depend on whether we're showing personality. So I was just talking about that. If we're trying to communicate that sort of personality, and be it fun, be it empathy, we'll be looking at how they draw people. But if we're using illustration to represent product, then we might be looking at how they draw a watering can, for example. So it will depend on the project. But usually for branding, I'm looking at something that is not too layered, not too detailed, because we want it to come across really clearly, because we may be using it at all different scales. Sometimes I might be looking at format, that maybe vector artwork is more useful if we're using it in lots of different ways.
And that illustrator, so you're thinking about who you're approaching at the start of a project, would that illustrator need obvious branding focused images, say, in their portfolio?
No, not at all. If we are looking for a particular style, we may just be looking at the craft of it, their handwriting of the illustration. It may just be that we have a particular style that's very exuberant or very sketchy and delicate, and it may be that quality that we're looking for rather than their experience with branding.
And do you work with illustrators in different ways?
I think we do work with illustrators in different ways, and it probably comes down to how much of the background they need to know and how much their illustration is representing the parent brand. So it may be that they're working on quite a small component. It might be the pictograms or some icons that are a small part of an identity or a packaging design system. Or they may be covering the entire box or the hero image for the whole branding program. And then we'd probably bring them in a little bit sooner and give them more background information.
So you've all worked together. Nicola and Kate, you've both worked in-house as freelancers for Together Design. So I think it would be really interesting to explore this relationship. Heidi, how do you brief Kate and Nicola and other illustrators who work for you?
Well, how we brief Kate and Nikki is maybe a bit different to how we brief an external illustrator who we're working with on one project, because they've been designers and intrinsically know all parts of a design process. you possibly get less organised briefs.
Well, I'd say we make our own briefs in the studio more.
Yes.
Yeah, we'd put it together to run it past the client, but it's something we'd then look at ourselves later.
Yes.
So it's a bit more self.
If they're working as a designer and an illustrator on a project that we're doing, you're more likely to have been involved in the strategy, in the research. And so we may be writing the brief together as we go with those early parts of the process. So it maybe requires less of a formal, okay, here's the illustrative part of the brief and here's a very neat formulated brief. It will be a bit more free form, won't it?
Yes, definitely.
100%. And a lot more fluid. There's not like a set time that we do the illustration per se when we're working in-house. It's more, we do a bit of this and then the packaging comes along and then you illustrate for that and then adapt it. And it's a little bit less set out and formulaic.
I guess during that process, it's important to ask particular maybe questions to Heidi or either the commissioner. You're thinking you're framing your own brief. Is there any questions that you can think of that might be?
A list as long as my arm. Absolutely.
I think there are some key things like deadline, the scope of the work. Say if it's packaging, what's the line list? So how many packs are we doing? It's going to be so different if we're doing 3 or if we're doing 50. You know, that's going to really change things. Where you're going to be using those illustrations, how long for, and then more specific things like maybe they've got a cutter guide ready because you're going to have to fit things into a certain area, maybe print spec, what they can achieve. Anything else, do you think?
Yes, sometimes what the sign-off process is for the client and how many options they might want to see, what level of sketch they may be happy with in order to sign off an idea before going into final artwork.
A niche one, but more and more whether it's going to be ever made to move. So if it's going to be illustration for animation in the end, it needs to be created in a slightly different way with different bits that are movable than if you were doing it just for static. So the scope of where it could go in the future is very important at the beginning because you don't want to have to recreate something for later use.
I think if it was an illustration for a branding project, which was perhaps part of a corporate identity, I think asking the question sort of why are you doing this now? And what are you hoping to achieve or communicate with the image is quite an important one because packaging tends to work on a bit of a cycle. You tend to refresh packaging every few years, whereas for a company identity, you tend to only refresh it, if you're lucky, every 10 years or even longer. And asking why now will usually give you some information that might not make it to a sort of brief that's more about just the practical criteria. Give you a bit of an insight.
It might be quite interesting to focus on some of the particular projects that you've worked on together, so we could maybe explore the process from the beginning to the end. How did the Charbonnel and Walker Easter egg range project evolve?
That's Nikki.
Yeah, they came to us with wanting to refresh their Easter collection that we tend to refresh every, I don't know, it depends.
We'd done their Christmas range maybe twice before. They usually keep one design for 2 years. And then they obviously started to think they could do something with Easter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we came up with a concept for it in conjunction with the client. Actually, we were discussing what they wanted to achieve and what look they were going for. And then we went away and did rough scamps and sketches. I think we both did initial sketches for that one, didn't we, at the same time? I can't remember. It was a while ago. And then showed those to the client and then they approved them and then we go off. And it is very different, though, working in-house to working in isolation as an illustrator because when you're in-house, you're working next to your creative director and they're a lot more involved in how it looks the whole way through as opposed to where you would be working on something and maybe have a deadline in a week and then check in with the creative director. It's a lot more of a collaboration, a partnership, I would say, than some of my other illustration work, which has been more in a void of working on your own and then sharing later.
That's really interesting. And you're working in-house now?
No, I'm freelance now. I've just taken the jump and it's terrifying.
She's going to be brilliant.
Yeah.
I think there's pros and cons for that, isn't there? the sort of being in-house, sitting next to your creative director, I mean, that sounds like it comes with difficulties of lots of iterations, but also comes with benefits.
And you get such good results for collaborating so early.
Getting to a result quite quickly.
Absolutely.
Everybody sort of knowing what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And not all the pressure is just on you.
Yeah.
You've got other people there,
Having a
and
team.
you can say, you know, even in the early stages with just really rough sketches, how do you think about this? And usually it's, in fact, pretty much always really, really helpful having someone else to have a look at those and
Completely.
improve on what you might have done on your own.
Someone to sense check
Yes.
what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, even when you're working on your own, if you've got someone you can bounce stuff off, it always helps to have a second pair of eyes.
Do you think illustrators should check in more with their clients? So as a substitute for maybe not sitting next to their creative director?
Yes, it would be nice if the client doesn't mind. So you don't want to annoy them, but it definitely helps if you've got a good connection to bounce ideas off and show some rough work.
Especially in the early rounds.
Yeah.
I think the communication can taper off less once you've got approval. But at the beginning, it's so invaluable to have contact.
Maybe that's more the case when you're working with a design agency and you're speaking to a creative director or someone similar. It might be different when you're working with a client and you need a more finished idea, do you think, Heidi?
I think that's right. As the creative director, I love to see work in progress, sketches, and sometimes it just helps that short form of communication to jump on the phone and talk about how things are going. Also might get you to the result quicker. If you've done the brilliant first idea and you've cracked it first time, then don't even do a second. If I'm happy with that as a creative director, then it might save you time. I think it might be different if you're working directly for a client, especially if it's quite a big organisation. You may find that you send early sketches and then you've got a committee of 8 people looking at them. In that instance, it might have been better to wait and send a couple of routes, send it mocked up in situ, and you'll probably get more valuable feedback that way.
And does it sometimes help sell an idea in if they can actually see it on a mocked up on something? Very often if you present it nicely, they're more likely to say yes to it than if it was a rough sketch, because it's easier to clearly see it in their mind.
I think
maybe.
that's right. See it in context, and it's just easier to approve.
And it feels more collaborative if you share regularly. I feel you can work together to get the perfect result instead of it all being on you. It's nicer to share the burdens.
Can be reassuring.
Yeah.
Just taking back to some of the projects, the Fortnum and Mason, the Halloween biscuits, they're so exciting. I don't know if you could tell me a little bit about that project.
So the Fortnum's chocolate biscuits, they came to us with this idea of a new range that they had, these very chocolatey biscuits. They were handmade and focused on the very nice ingredients that they use. And their brief was that they should be suitable for a self-purchase, but also very much a gift for someone as well. So we were really lucky to have a look through their archives.
Oh, it was mind-blowing.
And
It
I
was
think,
so-
yes, and Nikki went and had a look through them.
So that was part of the kind of research process,
Yeah.
was really exploring their archive. And was that like older versions of packaging from the
Yeah,
past?
so they have got a really long history of working with amazing artists and illustrators.
Edward Borden, Kathleen Hale, John Banting.
And right back to their ancient catalogues that they had back where they were like doing bits for the war and stuff.
Yeah.
And they created the first Scotch egg and Edward Borden illustrated that. It was incredible. It was so in depth. And it gives you quite a rich history to pull off.
So when they were taking you for the archive, part of the briefing was then to reference or to build on this history.
And their kind of tone of voice, their wit that they use. It's really kind of a unique client with that kind of history, and that you know that they have already invested in artists in that way. And they would like to continue to bring across that personality that's really part of their brand.
I think that there's a lovely lightness of touch, isn't there?
Yeah.
And as you say, wit.
And storytelling as well. And that was really something that came through in the biscuits. And I think that those packs are different to some of the other ranges because they have one shape and we've only got maybe 4 or 5 in that range. So we could really do a mini story on each pack. It's different if you've got a range with maybe 20 packs and they've got tea and biscuits and chocolates with different sized packaging. You're going to need more of a toolkit that adapts for that, and it's more of like a system.
Whereas the clamshell biscuit boxes are more like an indulgent artwork that's bespoke for that pack shape, and you can be a bit more in depth with how you apply the illustration.
I was just going to ask, with this storytelling element, do they come to you with an idea of what that story might be?
They didn't.
No. So that was part of the brief. So the things that they want to portray on those biscuits, that the handmade quality, the chocolatiness, and also that they need to be beautiful.
I think we went with 3 concepts.
Yeah, we had 3 ideas at the beginning.
I found them on the server the other day.
I looked at them today. So kind of 3 boards with mood board images on there, quite a few from their archives, and then some which might hint towards the style and maybe the colour palette. Mm-hmm. And then sketches of ideas of the packs. So we had 3 routes like that. And then they picked one. And then we developed that one pack more clearly, more detailed. And then we wrote down exactly what we were going to do for the other packs. So really, really detailed in terms of the colour palette and the scene, so that we could have a bit more signed off before we actually start sketching.
I think they wanted to hint at the origin of the ingredients in the biscuits. Was a bit of a part of how were we
How are we going to get the ingredients through? And partly that's colour, and some of them actually have lemons on there, or it might just be the scene hints at nuts in the forest.
Or the characters hint so well. Yeah.
And then right at the end, drawing up all the packs and artworking at the end. So it's really good to get things agreed as much as you can before you really do a lot of work with the client, if you can, even just through notes writing.
That's another benefit of being an in-house designer / illustrator, is that you get to see your work being rolled out and get to be involved in the rollout. Whereas sometimes as an illustrator, you just send it off and see it when it's on shelf, but you got to guide that through application to each of the packs. And
I think in that one I was doing most of that. We had an art worker who was finishing it off, making sure it's all perfect. But for that project, and it would be different for other ones, but that particular one,
that was the chocolatey biscuits one. Then, Kate, did you work on the Halloween biscuits too? And did that come later? Or
that was later.
So you'd already become quite familiar with Fortnum & Mason maybe as a client.
And also the difference with that project was the biscuits, we had Katia from Together, who's the creative director there, and me working on it. And then with the Halloween one, we had Katia and another employee Together, Bryony, who's another creative director. So she had some ideas, and Katia. So it's a bigger team working on it, and an art worker.
I think I worked on it as well.
And Heidi and Nikki helping.
It's a bigger range.
It's a bigger range. And then that is an example of having more of a system where you have assets that you're using to keep the range together, but also each pack feels a bit different. You need pace through a range like that, but then they all need to tie together too. So you need more movable elements that you can swap around and fit into different formats.
And with the storytelling aspect of that, were you looking for one story that unified all of the collection, or did each pack have a different
So for that project, we had done their Easter range, and the brief for that was all about extraordinary chickens and the amazing varieties that there are and all the different patterns on their feathers. And then we kind of used a similar idea for Halloween, thinking about all the lovely pumpkins and gourds and textures that you find there.
What I loved about that project so much was that you did autumn so beautifully, but then really cleverly turned it into Halloween by carving the faces into the pumpkins.
So you have those beautiful leaves and decorative elements, and then you have these impish,
ghoulish faces.
Yeah.
They were
the
incredible.
fun little bits that you find hidden amongst.
Which also helped to like elevate the autumn stuff to a more of a foodie world, and then make the Halloween stuff more playful with those hands coming in that look like tree hands. It was really fun to roll out that one. It was good.
It's a lovely opportunity to design packaging for someone like Fortnum and Mason, where you know they're going to be beautifully merchandised in store. And you know that the shoppers are going to have a little bit more time to pick them up and examine them, so you can cover every centimetre of the surface with lovely, interesting things to look at. It can be quite different for designing packaging that might be in a supermarket environment where you are squished up against lots of other brands, having to shout a little louder perhaps to be heard.
And Fortnum's windows are just mind-blowing. They're so, so good. And I can imagine when you've illustrated it and then see it in the window, it's like, wow.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah, always lovely.
Yeah.
Heidi, is there any projects that you'd like to raise? I know we're talking a lot about packaging, but is there one that's maybe more branding?
Yes. We were talking about how would we define the word branding in this instance. And for us, when we think about that word branding, we're often thinking about the imagery that is intrinsically linked to a company's corporate identity and very much representing that organisation from its values, from its personality, from perhaps what it does. And that's a little different to sometimes with a packaging project. It can come and go. It can be there just for seasonality because it's for Easter or Halloween. It's in there one day and gone tomorrow. It's less of a evergreen image that's there all the time. So thinking about branding in the truest sense of that meaning, I was thinking about some illustration, a sort of illustrative toolkit that we did for an animal charity, where drawing the animals that Nikki worked on, her animals for this charity, just had to have so much personality that they were really representing the charity and will be there for a long time. That I feel is sort of more branding that is intrinsically linked to the parent brand.
100%. And I think it helps us when we use illustration in those scenarios, because you can't show a picture of the animal because it's too specific. So you need something a bit looser and a bit more personality based than a type of animal. So it was quite a hard brief, but I think we found a really good solution for that.
Perfectly imperfect.
Perfectly imperfect.
Did you have quite a long time to work on that?
Yeah, that was a quite, long time for together, maybe for how quickly we turn things around. Sometimes it's faster. It was a lot of drawing over maybe a couple of weeks, and then we scanned everything in and picked our favourites. And I maybe did hundreds and hundreds.
I think your hand hurt because you were drawing animals really quickly. I think the whole project itself, we had a good amount of time, but the moment we alighted on the style for the animals, it's like, brilliant, now we need 50 of them.
Yeah.
And we didn't have long, I think, to do those.
No, definitely not.
And then did you have to picture or show your designs or drawings and they went
Absolutely, yeah. We'd take them across packaging mock-ups, and that's so handy to be able to do and show them in their best light of how you would want to apply them, because then it gets given out to licensees and they've done a beautiful job with it. But it's nice to be able to show the client how you imagine them being used instead of just giving them a blank sheet of assets. So.
And these images were going across all sorts of things, so all sorts of substrates, materials, across stationery and ceramics and digital applications. And so that's something we think about sort of very early on. If an image is going to go across so many different formats or channels, you have to think about how it's constructed so that it can change format.
And always work in the highest resolution you can, because you never know how big it's going to go.
Good tip. These are quite exciting projects we're talking about, but I wanted to ask if there had been any challenging projects and maybe how you've overcome these. And do you have any examples of any bad practice you might have come across?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think early on in my career, I haven't had lots of bad experiences, but maybe one or two challenging projects where I haven't been very clear at the beginning about what they own, and they're inexperienced too, so they don't really know what they own. And then we get to the end of the project and they've thought that they've bought an image that I thought was for one product, and then they're going to make a whole business out of this product and put it on absolutely millions of things. And then we have to kind of figure out how we retrospectively sort all of that out. So I think that comes from my inexperience and their inexperience, and maybe you just learn that as you go along. And one of my tips was going to be to have terms and conditions up front, written down very clearly.
I think a lot of the examples I can think of that where things have gone a bit wrong is probably linked to the same things. It's about IP and who owns what, and being really clear up front where something's going to be used. We commissioned an illustrator for a job at some point, and we agreed the terms with the client. So we quite often play the middleman in that instance and agree how it's going to be used and where it's going to be used. And then sometime later, the client used it for something else, because clearly the message just sat with maybe the main team, but somebody else through, not in any malicious way, but it was just used more broadly than we were expecting. And quite rightly, the illustrator was upset, and I think the client was blaming us, and we were like, oh, it's the client. And it's where it maybe hasn't been clear from the start how something needs to be used, or it's just been forgotten along the way.
It is quite a confusing thing if you haven't worked in that area before, and if you have a client who has no experience working with an illustrator or a photographer or whatever, they might just think that they've bought it and that's their thing. So I think it's really important to, at the very beginning, to make sure that they understand those things. Lots of clients will absolutely understand it, won't they?
Yeah. Oh, yes. And know what to ask for.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
We usually now like the contract to be between the artist and the client. So even if the work is being commissioned through us and we have perhaps negotiated the terms of the deal and helped to be the conduit for those discussions, we would rather the contract in the end is between the illustrator and the client, so that when we're long gone and out of the process, if anyone wants to extend usage rights, or if the illustrator sees their work being used in a way they're not happy with, they have a direct contact. Just makes things easier.
Nicola and Kate, you both work as illustrators and designers, and I find that, really interesting because you're almost doing two roles, and I was wondering how that complemented your work in branding.
I think it definitely gives us a good sensitivity to illustration and applying illustration. So when we work with people we've commissioned, we tend to be able to roll it out in a way that they're normally very happy with, because we do it in a way we'd want our own work to be rolled out.
Yeah, more sensitive to their work. Yeah,
absolutely.
You can write a really good illustration brief.
Write a mean illustration brief.
I think for packaging projects, where particularly if you have a very big range, a long line list of many, many packs, having that designer mind is really helpful, because you almost set yourself up with a system of parts which you can interchange for each of the packs, and you might need to be able to move stuff around, so you can't really do one fixed illustrative piece, which for editorial maybe that would be what it's like, but for packaging you need to be able to maybe pull things apart and move things around, and then you have more of a system. And I think that graphic design head helps you achieve that. And also I think understanding that your work is part of a bigger picture as well, so maybe you're a little bit less precious over some changes, because you understand that it's the whole branding that you're just part of.
From an observer, it certainly means that the typography and the logo placement all feels just beautifully balanced.
Yeah, it's all kind of part of it.
Thinking about it all at the same time.
More unified.
Yeah, maybe nothing
so,
fights like it would if you were just thinking about illustration or just graphic design.
So do you find that working as both an illustrator and a designer on these projects, you might have more creative control over the outcome?
Yeah,
definitely for rollout, 100%.
Yeah. I think you do, yeah.
Because if you're applying, say, like the Halloween stuff and the leaves aren't working on one of the packs, you can just redraw those and make them better.
Yeah. You
for
can
that
just change
specific instance. Whereas if you were commissioning someone to do that, it would be a bit harder to do those minute changes to make something work.
Yeah.
So it might make the process quicker.
I'm sure it does make the process quicker,
Absolutely.
Definitely.
I think it turns you into a bit of a chameleon as well, which can maybe have its pros and cons.
Absolutely. I started as a designer. I had a passion for drawing and stuff, but I'd never really been an illustrator. And then I got my first job with Heidi and Katia Together and became an illustrator as I grew there, I guess. So my styles wandered depending on the projects that I'm working on. So, for example, the animal charity stuff, we would have something a bit looser. And then working for the Hawes branding, we did the illustrations of the watering cans on the side of pack, and they're very linear and mechanical looking illustration. And maybe as an independent illustrator, I wouldn't flex like that. But because I'm in-house, I tend to do a bit of everything and adapt my style. It still has my handwriting in it, and it still feels like it's from me, but
that's part of being a graphic designer.
Absolutely.
Because you don't come with a style as a graphic designer. You're fulfilling the brief and solving a problem. So then you adjust yourself to fit what's the best solution for that project.
And do you feel like that's how you work on a lot of these projects? It's more you're looking in the archives at Fortnum & Mason, so you're trying to draw on these other styles. It's maybe not just simply your voice as an illustrator?
Yeah, I think so. Although, I mean, Heidi and Katia Together would pick the right person for the project as well.
It may be that you can work flexibly and turn your hand to a few different styles, but we wouldn't want to force anyone to do something that just feels unnatural. And I think artists will just have an affinity towards a certain style or a certain subject matter, and so we would absolutely play into people's strengths. Nikki, I've seen your style really develop over the 10 years or so that we've known each other, and I'd say I would spot a Nikki illustration now a mile off as her style has evolved. And I think, Kate, you had a way of drawing people, for example, from the beginning that couldn't be anyone other than Kate.
Yeah.
And that's been interesting.
We were talking also about how I kind of think maybe style is partly the thinking behind it as well. So the way that you approach a brief and the thinking behind it can be part of that illustrative style. And then also for me, I've always done a lot of pattern. So that's quite often part of the work that I do. And maybe it's not always the same style, but the same way of approaching a project. Yeah.
Tessellating kit of parts.
Yeah, exactly.
I also wanted to go back to that idea, Nicola, that you'd started almost as a designer and you've got this, I know we were talking about two hats before, and you've developed this illustrative hat. How did that happen? Did you get given space in projects?
It's actually Kate's fault. So when I started, Kate was full-time together, and I hadn't, it never really occurred to me that you could be both. When I was at university, you were told pick illustration or pick design or pick motion, and there was not many hybrid opportunities or having a bit of everything in your portfolio. It was kind of discouraged to do that. I think maybe it's not like that anymore, I don't know, but I feel like I didn't know that you could be a designer and an illustrator, that you'd just be working with illustrators maybe. And then I came together and Kate was doing both, and I was like, oh, maybe you can. And I think it was quite obvious that I could do illustration, I just didn't do it.
It was very obvious, so we just kept asking her to do more.
And then being given those opportunities to work on things, like alongside Kate and just in my own right as well. Together I started to build more of a confidence in it, and then it snowballed, and now I would class myself as an illustrator and a designer more than a designer who can illustrate.
Mm.
We both also do work where we're just illustrators as well.
Yeah.
And also we do work where we're just graphic designers
yeah.
too.
And there's projects that we put out where there's no illustration in sight,
Yeah, exactly.
and they still work.
I guess that gives you quite a lot of versatility with your work.
Yeah.
So I guess thinking about your portfolios and the range of the work that you have in, I mean, Kate, you were mentioning you have these patterns that come in that make it quite clear it's your style. So have you ever been conscious about what elements of your work could be attractive to commissions for branding, say like the patterns?
The patterns were actually the thing that probably got me in with Together, because you were doing some...
We were doing a lot of...
style guides and
style
gifting.
guides for seasonal ranges.
Yes.
And a lot of that might be a box where you needed a frame, but it was a wash bag where you needed a pattern.
Yeah.
And some other
Yeah.
thing where you needed a placement.
And then it goes on a bottle as well. And so the pattern thing got me in with Together. There was a point where I realised I needed to start drawing people, because I don't think I had people, because I was doing patterns and they were maybe leaves and butterflies and that kind of thing. So I started drawing some, and I had an Etsy shop and I put them in as little prints, and then Marks and Spencer's design team saw those, and then I had a very, very large, over 100 packs for their summer range to design.
On Etsy, they spotted you.
Yeah.
Right.
So they saw those on Etsy. So yeah, I think if you see there's something that you need to do, and then it was just personal projects. I just drew some funny looking people. Yeah, you don't know where they might take you.
I think having people in your portfolio is so important, for especially the type of work we're discussing. But it's the hardest thing to nail, your people style. It's always a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely hard.
And both of you, even when you were full-time at Together Design, I think you've both just carried on drawing. There's been personal projects all the way along. We're never too worried if someone has a side hustle. They should
very forgiving.
follow their passions and deserve great commissions wherever they come from. So I think that has helped.
Definitely, yeah. I think I've always had extra things going on.
Extracurricular work.
Yeah.
So I guess you might have lots of different variations of your portfolio depending on what the work is or what the client
make
is.
several portfolios
definitely.
out of my body of work.
Yeah.
It depends on what the client's asking for or what you're applying for. And then you can pull and dismember and make it something new.
And as a commissioner, that's interesting because it's nice to see a bit of a variety in people's portfolios. But at the same time, I also want to see a bit of a common thread that runs through things to understand what somebody's illustrative DNA is.
And know what you're going to get when you commission that person.
Yes. Yeah. I think a good way to do it is to have a main body of work in your folio that's perhaps the style that you think is particularly right for the person you're sharing it with, but then showing some of your sketchbooks or showing some others as a little sideline.
Yeah.
I also draw
Or
in this
maybe
style.
once you've got to know them a bit more, because once you've got one project and then they might go, oh, you can do this as well. Well, we'll get you in again for another thing.
Yeah, that does.
I mean, that very often happens.
Yeah.
And actually, even if you don't have the stuff in your visible portfolio, if they like your style, they'll tend to ask you, have you drawn a fish before? And then you can dig one out from your archives and be like, this is how I draw fish. It's a conversation normally if the style's right.
Are there any restraints involved in branding or branding for packaging or other areas that you've come across?
There might be technical restraints in terms of what you can print.
Print processes, colours.
Often, if it's a branding system that may be used on lots of different things, we might want to extend backgrounds. We might want the colours to reflect the core colours of that brand.
There's been occasions where we've really liked an illustrator's work, but they've worked for a competitor very closely or branded something similar, so we needed to move away from their style to help contain differentiation between those two brands.
Differentiate in the market. You may find as well, if it's part of quite a transformational piece of branding work for an organisation that's really changing up how they go to market, then you may well find that's a bigger group of people who need to sign everything off, and that might mean that the commissioner, like ourselves, is perhaps asking for test pieces, should be paid, or asking to use imagery maybe from your folio to show in visuals, just to mock up how something might look, with the right approvals from the artist, of course.
Nicola and Kate, how does an art director or commissioner bring out the best in you for this kind of area of illustration?
A strong brief.
Yeah,
always.
a clear brief.
I guess you'd work on that maybe with them. You'd saying that you'd develop the brief.
I think so, yeah. Being available for feedback. I always really like to be in contact quite a lot to bounce off those initial ideas, make sure we're not going really off down the wrong path.
So feedback, maybe meetings or keeping in contact.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, WhatsApp's great for doing some screen grabs as you're going along if they don't
we
mind.
got in a bad habit over the pandemic, didn't we?
I think a really good brief doesn't need to be that long.
No.
It probably shouldn't be too long. If we've done a big strategy phase before we move into design for a client, there could be reams of documents there about target market and competitor brands and positioning statements and all sorts. And I think the art is to distill that down into a brief that is no more than 5-6 pages max. Would you say?
Easily.
Yeah.
Enough context to really give a good potted history of how the project has come about, but not too much so it kills the mood.
And we were talking about style as well. So that's the idea of style and branding style in your portfolios. And do you find that style might affect a commission and that the brand might look for a style that fits?
I think the brand might look for a style that fits, but as an artist, I wouldn't worry about that because you're either going to be right for it or not, and there's lots more.
And there's always
jobs
something
out
you're
there.
right for.
Yeah, there's always something you're right for. If you want to show that your work has versatility, maybe you've done a lot of book covers, but you'd love to get into corporate branding, then doing some of that work as a personal project
I think that's so
always
important
good.
to make it really clear so that they don't have to make the leap of seeing your work on that thing. If you can apply it in a way that shows it could work on a book cover, for example, then you're giving it to them on a platter and showing that your style's right for that. And it doesn't have to be a real project. It can just be like a daydream project that you've got up your sleeve.
What would you say to an illustrator who is interested in working within branding but isn't sure where to start?
Go and see as many people as possible and keep in touch with all those people. This is the same for us when we're looking for clients. Don't take one no. It may not be a no. It may just be, thank you for that. Nothing at the moment, but we'll keep you in mind.
Yeah.
You know, don't think of that as, oh, I'll never work with them. Do keep in touch. Send them new things that you've been doing.
Clients we've sent stuff to and it's been years and then they've come out with the woodwork and worked with us. So staying in touch, be nice to everyone.
Keep LinkedIn, whatever it is you're doing. Don't be scared of that horrible word, networking, because it is just meeting people and being curious without expectation. And many of our friends have become clients and clients have become friends. And I think it's the same when you're an illustrator.
Absolutely.
Working, just go meet people who are doing interesting things and show them the interesting things you're doing.
Yeah, and the more you've got out there, the more you'll get commissioned for. I think if you have your case studies always and add things that you want to do that you haven't been hired for yet. Because if they see it, they'll hire you for it.
Yes. Fake it till you make it, Nikki says.
Heidi, Kate and Nicola, how do you agree a price for the work? I know we were talking about that earlier as in maybe things that could go wrong in a project, but how would you go about agreeing a price?
It is quite complicated. It really depends on each project. I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but I always do think of my base day rate to make sure that I'm definitely going to be getting
Covering
at least
your
that.
costs.
Yeah.
I think it's about scale, how much the image is going to be seen, how big that company is that's using it, because the value to them has to be taken into account.
How long they're using it for.
How long they're going to use it for. if your work is being quite intrinsically linked to a brand and they may not want you to do work for a competitor brand, you need to bear in mind that you may have to say no to another commission that comes along. So your fee for the original piece should make that worth it.
Yeah.
And you should make sure you like the brand
Yes,
that
definitely.
you're representing.
That's
And
quite important.
Yeah.
very important.
Yeah.
It's so
Especially
important.
when your work could be linked to them for 10 years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
and forever on the internet.
Yeah.
And then it's the other variables like how many channels, how many formats. Is it going on a product that might be for sale? That would be another level of fees.
Then you've got to just think if you just really, really love it and you just want to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Or it might lead to more work, or you might win awards and be more visible because of that project.
Yes.
I think there's quite a few variables.
If you're going to say yes to doing something for fees that are a little lower than you'd like, then make sure you're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, is it a charity? Is it a cause you believe in? Is
Yeah.
it something you want to help promote? And they're just so unique, every fee, I think.
And if you are doing a reduced cost, I don't know if you do this with your clients, but sometimes I'll actually have that on the invoice
Yeah, I
saying
do that.
this is
Yeah.
a special
Yes.
price, just to remind them.
So then when they rebook you,
Yeah.
if they rebook you,
Yeah.
you can go to your original price that you should
Yeah.
have charged.
Very good tip.
How do you navigate IP rights?
Oh, again, with
Terms and
lots of
conditions.
starting with some
Yeah.
terms and conditions. As you were saying before, Kate, sometimes a client may not have commissioned an artist before. They may not know what to ask for. They may not realise that they're not getting the rights for ever and more to use whatever on whatever they want. So just starting with some terms and conditions that state who owns it, and then kind of work from there to agree how that might be used in the future.
Can you all think about 3 things as a takeaway for our listeners? They can be quite short, they don't have to be too long, but 3 takeaway ideas or thoughts.
First one, I think we probably all have on ours, is terms and conditions.
Yeah.
Make sure that you've got everything agreed up front before you start a project, because it's hard to retrospectively agree things. So
Yeah.
get them out of the way
Yeah.
early, and so that everyone is on board with the same principles.
Yeah, I have a terms and conditions sheet, and then I also have an acceptance of commission form for the illustrations, and it really, really covers everything.
Come across as collaborative, be collaborative, don't just come across as collaborative. And that's the sort of, just get on the phone to have feedback conversations, ask lots of questions about the brand, do a bit of research into them yourselves, because that will just help conversation flow and will certainly give you more background to a brief.
I found that as I've gone through my career and had similar projects coming up, that it's really good to keep track of how long everything takes, how long I take to work on the project, how long the feedback is. Then that will help me with a future project, when very often the client will ask, how long do you think this is going to take? And then I can have a look back through past projects that are similar, and also helps with idea of costs as well.
And timings is another one for when you're taking into consideration how your style is.
Yes.
Try and keep it to something that you can do quickly-ish, because the longer it takes, the less likely they're going to want to commission you if you're going to take weeks and weeks to do something.
Depending on the project,
Of
probably,
course, yeah.
I think ask lots of questions and don't be afraid to ask a question that you might think is stupid.
Yeah.
Do that all the time. I pride myself on how many stupid questions I can answer, because it will just help you feel really comfortable of knowing what the client is expecting to see. How many roughs? Do they just want 1? Do they want 2? Do they want 3? And don't think you should know everything, because none of us do.
Really good on questions, collaboration, being aware
Yeah.
of timing,
Yeah.
terms and conditions.
Work for nice people.
Yeah.
and keep working for them, because generally they'll look after you and they have your best interests at heart. And also working for me, working for Together, they've made my work probably much, much better than I could have done on my own. And having those people around you makes a huge, huge difference.
Yeah, it shapes your career.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And your enjoyment of the job, 100%.
Isn't that lovely? It's all about enjoyable collaboration.
Yeah.
That's why we're called Together.
Yes.
Thank you. A really brilliant talk with our guest today. Some interesting points were raised, and some of our main takeaways are that any illustrator can have the opportunity to work within branding, and it's important to consider the client when presenting your portfolio, bearing in mind that even if you have a couple of different visual approaches, you should have a common thread, your illustrator's DNA. It is important to understand the client, researching the brand and remembering that your work is part of a bigger picture. For more information on terms and conditions, licensing and contracts, AOI members can check out the website for resources on these topics and access to the pricing calculator tool, which assists in working out fee levels for quotes. There is also a number of free resources available for all illustrators to access. If you haven't heard it already, episode 1 of Inside Illustration on editorial is available now. Thank you for listening.